Hello everyone, and welcome back to Scary Interesting and to another collection of horrible fates. In this video, we're going to go over 3 horrifying stories of people who put their trust in the wrong person. And in the end, this would have devastating results. The first story is particularly brutal, even for this channel, so as a reminder, although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. The Renaissance period was a time of great artistic, scientific, and technological achievement in human history. Fields like astronomy, anatomy, geography, and mathematics were heavily developed during the time, and previously held beliefs were challenged by an improved understanding of the natural world. Even religion experienced advancement, although this wasn't always met with the same enthusiasm as scientific discoveries or innovations that improved the lives of the average person. The 16th century in particular was marked by a massive theological change. As the 1500s began, Christianity saw major divisions leading to the creation of Lutheran and Calvinist churches, among others. There was also a lesser-known, smaller movement known as the Radical Reformation, which produced branches like the Anabaptists, who believed that baptism should not occur during infancy. Instead, they believed that the only way to be cleansed of sin by baptism was to make the choice by free will, which was something that kids weren't able to do. In the 1500s, this belief put the Anabaptists on the religious fringe. As a result, they were persecuted because the movement was seen as a threat to the Catholic Church. And all over Europe, Anabaptism was a crime punishable by a prolonged, awful death like beheading, being drawn and quartered, and most commonly burned at the stake. Dirk Willems was born in Asperen, a town south of Amsterdam and east of Rotterdam in the Netherlands. Much of his early life is unknown, but it is certain that he was rebaptized at a relative's home sometime in his late teens. This ceremony was symbolic of Dirk undoing his blasphemous baptism as an infant and embracing his religion with his own free will. In the eyes of the state, however, Dirk had just become a criminal. In the mid-1500s, the Dutch were governed by Spain, which was still in the midst of its religious inquisition with the goal of eradicating heresy. Anabaptism fit these qualifications, and when officials found out about his second baptism, Dirk became a marked man. A thief catcher, which is the equivalent of a modern-day bounty hunter, was sent to capture Dirk, and after doing so, he was tried, convicted, and imprisoned for his beliefs. Unbeknownst to the prison guards, however, Dirk wasn't going to stick around to suffer whatever awful fate they had planned. He was being held in a castle that had been converted to a prison, and on the night of May 12, 1569, he tore up his bedsheet and fashioned a rope to safely get him to the ground below. Except, it wasn't actually solid ground below. Dirk was being kept in a structure surrounded by a moat. Luckily for him though, although it was well into spring, much of the moat was still iced over. So under the cover of night, Dirk tied one end of his rope to his cell and dropped the slack out the window. Then, hand over hand, he lowered himself down his makeshift rope, and when he was at the bottom, he extended his leg to test the ice and found it strong enough to support him. By the time he had both feet on the ice, a guard noticed the escape attempt and began to come after him. Dirk then took off across the ice, heading toward the land on the other side of the moat. Because he had been starved during his time in prison, he was weak and emaciated, but this made him light enough for the ice to hold him. With the other side of the pond in view, Dirk raced toward it when he heard the distinct sounds of cracking ice and splashing water behind him. The guard who was coming after him was far too heavy for the thin ice, and he crashed through. As he flailed and tried to get a handhold on any sturdy part of the ice, it kept breaking around him. It was almost immediately clear that if he wasn't helped, he would drown, so he began crying out for Dirk to save him. By that point, Dirk had already made it to the safety of the bank on the other side of the pond. He was basically home free, but in an ironic twist, it was the faith he was being persecuted for that caused him to go back. He then whispered a prayer as the guard begged and told his God that he would save the guard as a token of his faith. With that, he turned around and began gliding across the ice again in the direction of the desperate guard. When he reached the hole in the ice where the guard was trapped, Dirk, even in his emaciated, weakened state, extended his hand and managed to pull the guard out of the pond. Then, as the guard gathered himself and stood up, he thanked Dirk in a voice shaken by both cold and fear. In that moment, the guard resolved to let Dirk go as repayment for saving him, but this was quickly interrupted by the arrival of reinforcements and the voice of the burgomaster, who was basically the equivalent of the town mayor. Watching from a prison window, the burgomaster shouted down to the guard to remember the oath he swore to the Spanish Duke of Alva to bring criminals to justice. So, realizing that it was either Dirk's life or his own that would be lost with whatever decision he made, the guard whispered an apology to Dirk and placed him in handcuffs. Dirk was then returned to the prison, only this time he was placed in a cell at the very top of the church tower. His legs were also placed in stocks, ensuring another escape attempt would be impossible. For the next 4 days, he was relentlessly interrogated both physically and mentally, and his captors demanded that he renounce his faith and swear allegiance to the church, but Dirk wasn't swayed. He remained steadfast in his belief and refused to bend, and the longer this went on, the more his fate was sealed. On May 16, 1569, Dirk heard the footsteps of several guards approaching his cell. When they arrived outside, they opened the door, freed him from his leg stocks, and forcibly picked him up onto his feet. His legs were weak from days of lying in restraints, and Dirk could barely walk as the guards led him out of his cell and took him just outside his hometown. The wind was strong that day, and Dirk's long hair flooded around his face as he was marched toward a large wooden pole embedded in the ground. Once they reached the pole, they began to tie their prisoner to it, and when he was firmly secured in place, the pile of wood surrounding the base of the stake was lit. Burning at the stake as a punishment for heresy had a long history to that point. The very first mentions of it date back millennia, and during the Spanish Inquisition, it was a punishment authorities commonly opted for. Unsurprisingly, it was an agonizing one. Typically, once the fire took hold of the wood around the stake, the fire would make its way up until it was chest high, at which point the air would be toxic enough that the person would pass out. This wasn't always the case, though. The strong easterly wind that day was considerable, and as Dirk's lower body was engulfed, the fire was continually blown away from his upper body. As a result, Dirk had plenty of air to keep him conscious as the fire continued to rage. Supposedly, the wind also carried his voice for miles around as citizens of other towns heard him cry out more than 70 times. Apparently, even the guards overseeing the event were traumatized by Dirk's screams and the sight of his prolonged ordeal. In fact, the judge who sentenced Dirk to the very punishment he was witnessing had to turn his horse away as it continued. Finally, he'd seen enough and called one of the executioners over and ordered him to dispatch Dirk as quickly as possible. The final manner of Dirk's death is unknown, but it is confirmed that he died on the outskirts of Asperen that day. Ultimately, Dirk's conviction in his beliefs, unwillingness to renounce them, and willingness to help his enemy despite the consequences made him a revered martyr who is admired and celebrated today by the faith spawned by Anabaptism. It certainly makes you feel lucky to have been born at a time when such punishments are no longer used. It was a few minutes past 7 p.m. on the night of August 30th, 1988, when Lieutenant Alan Lawson was starting to get antsy. It had already been a hectic and chaotic day to that point, and his patience had already waned much earlier in the day. As a first lieutenant in the U.S. Marine Corps, Alan was a commanding officer during a war games exercise being conducted at the Combat Center in 29 Palms, California. This massive base is located in the middle of the Mojave Desert and covered 932 square miles of area at the time. It goes without saying that an August day in the desert is hot, and the temperature had remained at a steady 107 degrees Fahrenheit or 42 Celsius for much of the day. And even though they were losing daylight with the sun setting, the heat was relentless. But despite this, Alan didn't have the time to notice. This combat exercise involved moving a convoy of vehicles and troops on foot through the desert to a strategic target. During a meeting with officers earlier that afternoon, Alan received an order to place 14 Marines in pairs along the road to act as guides for the convoy. This order was also part of a larger plan to set up a defense in the likely case of an enemy attack, and road guides would help keep the convoy moving in the right direction while also serving to guard the route. After receiving the updated plans, Alan gathered his commanders and ordered them to send 2 Marines from each of their companies to perform road guide duties. He also told them that the chosen Marines were to meet him exactly at 1900 hours or 7 o'clock in the evening, but then, for reasons that aren't entirely clear, when the time came, only 2 of the 14 designees had arrived. As he grew increasingly annoyed by the guides being late, Alan was also approached by his commanding officer around 7:10 to find out why they hadn't left yet. This only increased the pressure he was feeling to get moving. Then, when only 6 more Marines had arrived by 7:20, Alan decided he couldn't wait any longer. He then ordered those who had showed up to board a Humvee, and he would have to just work with what he had. Among the group of 8 that showed up was Lance Corporal Jason Rother, who was a 19-year-old Minnesota native who felt like he was melting in the desert heat. This was a climate he wasn't used to at all, and it had been wearing on him ever since he arrived in the desert. Jason was part of another division based in North Carolina, and with long-time tensions rising between the US and Iraq, his company was sent to the Mojave Desert to train in an environment similar to that of the Middle East. And despite having been a successful wrestler in high school who was used to hard physical training, and despite him looking like he was born to wear a uniform, the desert had really taken a toll on him. Prior to the start of the war games, his division had already been at the combat center for 12 days of training, and the heat throughout was unbearable. On August 29th, Jason even had to fall out of training to be treated for heat exhaustion, only to be deemed fit to continue the planned exercise that began the following day. As he rode in the Humvee with 7 other road guides and awaited the drop-off at his post, a chain of events was already in motion that would unquestionably change the Marine Corps forever. After driving through the desert for 10 minutes, Alan ordered the Humvee to stop just beyond a sandy intersection that had been carved out by years of travel by military vehicles. He pointed at Jason and told him that this is where he'd be stationed. After Jason stepped out of the vehicle, Jason's partner also hopped out of the Humvee, but this was met with confusion and annoyance by Alan, who ordered him to get back on board. Then, when it looked like he was about to leave Jason at the checkpoint by himself, another soldier named William spoke up. He reminded Alan of the orders to place the men in pairs, but Alan responded by reminding everyone that he was the lieutenant and they were only one step above the Marines' lowest rank of private first class. Alan was already annoyed and feeling the pressure of the exercise starting off poorly, so with that, the Humvee took off to the next checkpoint, leaving Jason alone in the middle of the desert with night quickly approaching. Almost 48 hours later, the squad leader James noticed that something wasn't right. It took him a moment to put his finger on what it was, but he suddenly realized that he hadn't seen Jason since he left with the others in the Humvee 2 nights earlier. James then asked Alan about this, but Alan said he hadn't seen him either and just assumed that he was picked up by the last vehicle in the convoy during the early morning hours of August 31st. This is when it was finally learned that that had never happened. The following day, on September 1st, a massive search got underway involving 1,600 Marines on foot and in the air. When Jason was dropped off, he only had what was on him, which was 3 canteens holding a quart of water each, a rifle, and the clothes on his back. He didn't have a map or a compass, he weighed just 135 pounds, and he had already been suffering from heat-related illnesses. If he was still in the desert, the Marine Corps could be looking at an unprecedented tragedy. The search began at Jason's last known location, which was about a quarter mile or almost half a kilometer from the sandy intersection. There, they found a set of rocks that had been positioned in the shape of an arrow, and this discovery confirmed that one of the most egregious sins in the US military had been committed. The Marines had left a man behind. Unfortunately, despite the intense effort to find Jason, the arrow was the only sign of him the search produced, and after several days, the search was called off. Another got underway in November and ended with the same result. Then on December 4th, a third search was organized, and just a few hours into it, more stone arrows were discovered and led searchers to a pile of Jason's belongings. His entire uniform had been neatly folded and placed in the sand with reverence. Then next to the uniform pile was Jason's rifle, with his wallet sitting on the butt end of the rifle. His military ID was also missing from it. Then, less than 100 yards from Jason's gear, searchers found human remains that had been completely skeletonized. After more than 3 months, Jason had finally been found. Based on the findings of a later investigation, this is how Jason ended up dead in the Mojave Desert. On the afternoon of the training exercise, Alan had just been dismissed from the meeting and began to give out tasks related to road guide duty. What Alan didn't do, however, was determine how the road guides would end up back with their companies when the convoy mission was complete. None of the company commanders under him were made responsible for the road guide pickups, so each of them just assumed one of the others was handling it. Also, when Alan decided to leave with 8 Marines instead of 14, he was so angry about the defiance of his orders that he didn't brief any of the commanding officers on the updated number of Marines who would be on road guide duty. He was also supposed to provide command with a roster of the designated road guides, which he also failed to do in his agitated state. After dropping Jason off, Alan directed the Humvee to the next checkpoint and ordered William to man it. Once again, William reminded Alan that they were supposed to be posted in pairs, but all he got in return was another snide reply from his commanding officer. Alan then continued on the convoy route to place the other Marines, but it wasn't until he finished that he realized his significant oversight. By then, the convoy was set to begin any minute, so Alan sent his navigator to go back to each of the checkpoints and inform the Marines he just dropped off that they were to jump on the last vehicle in the convoy. The navigator then worked backward from the final staging area, first informing checkpoint 4 of the orders, then checkpoint 3, and at that point, the navigator saw the lead convoy vehicle, so he returned to the final staging area. During his interview with investigators, the navigator said that when he returned to the staging area, he told Alan he wasn't able to make it to checkpoint 1 or 2 to provide orders because the convoy was already on the road. Alan, on the other hand, told officials that the report he received from the navigator was that the road guides at checkpoints 1 and 2 had already been picked up by the convoy. It's not clear if this was a deliberate lie or just a misunderstanding between the two, but either way, the report made it clear that Jason's death resulted from a mix of poor control of emotions in high-stress situations, assumptions, and ego. In the aftermath, punishment was handed down up the command chain. First, the battalion commander and the battalion executive officer were reassigned, and Jason's platoon leader and company commander were relieved and reprimanded before being discharged from the Marine Corps. 3 officers also faced court-martial, and Jason's platoon sergeant and squad leader were both found guilty of dereliction of duty and demoted to lance corporal. As for Alan, he faced charges of dereliction of duty and disobeying a direct order for not pairing the road guides up. Then, adding insult to injury, during deliberations, Allen showed up to court drunk one day and received an additional charge for that. Finally, in February of 1989, a jury of 8 Marine Corps officers found Allen guilty of dereliction of duty, but innocent of the more serious charge of disobeying an order. He was ultimately sentenced to 4 months in a military prison for his role in Jason's death, and then discharged from the Marine Corps. And that brings us to Jason and what his last few hours were like. At some point in the middle of the night on August 30th, or very early on the morning of August 31st, Jason watched the very last vehicle in the convoy pass through his checkpoint and continue on to the next. After waiting a while at his post to be picked up, it must have become clear to him that he had been forgotten. Having taken survival courses in the past, Jason knew his options were limited. He could stay where he was and hope that someone would eventually come by, or he could try to walk out of the desert. He decided to walk, but was at a significant disadvantage without anything but the sun to guide him. He initially backtracked to where the Marines camped the night before, but when he found it abandoned, he started heading in the direction of the National Trails Highway. Where Jason's body was eventually found, he would have been able to see the highway just ahead of him. Tragically though, through the unforgiving desert terrain in the summer heat with very little water, Jason managed to cover 17 miles on foot, only to collapse and succumb to dehydration with salvation in sight. It's unclear exactly when he died, but medical examiners sadly believe he was dead before anyone even realized he was missing. Jason was eventually buried with full military honors in his hometown of Minneapolis. Victoria Cillier absolutely adored her husband, Emile Cillier, from the moment she first met him. He was handsome, charming, and confident, and she was immediately drawn to him when they met. The two first came together when Emile was being treated by Victoria, who was a physiotherapist, for a skiing injury. Outside of her family, Victoria's passion was skydiving, and on April 4th, 2015, Emile had a surprise for her. By that point, almost a year had passed since she last jumped out of a plane because she was pregnant. Only 5 weeks earlier, Victoria gave birth to their second child, and Emile knew how much she had missed skydiving. So as a nice surprise, and once she had recovered, he arranged a jump at a nearby airfield where Victoria had been a free-for-all instructor with more than 2,600 jumps in her career. Her abilities as a skydiver were highly respected by her peers, and she was particularly known for the care she provided novices. When the day came, the weather on April 4th wasn't terribly cooperative, with rain and clouds expected most of the day, but everyone held out hope that they'd catch a break anyway. While Victoria suited up and performed her preparation checklist, Emile volunteered to grab her a parachute. So with their 3-year-old's hand in his, he turned and walked toward the kit room. The two were gone long enough for Victoria to notice, but when they returned, Emile explained that their little one needed to make a pit stop at the washroom. Unfortunately though, after hours of waiting on the weather, it became apparent that it just wasn't going to clear and the jump was scrapped. So, disappointed, Victoria and the others changed out of their flight suits and started putting away their equipment. Since Victoria had a locker at the airfield, Emile took the parachute he had gotten for her and stowed it there for the night while everyone else returned theirs to the kit room. All 12 jumpers were then returned the next day for another try. Unfortunately as well, the weather wasn't much better on April 5th. The clouds and rain remained, and it again looked as if there would be no jump. The 12 jumpers grew anxious as the afternoon rolled in without the clouds rolling out. Around 4 p.m., it was suggested that they perform what's called a hop and pop jump from around 4,000 feet. This is a type of jump that omits one of the most exhilarating parts of skydiving, which is the free fall of thousands of feet. However, Victoria just wanted to get back in the sky, so it didn't matter to her what type of jump they'd be performing. Once everyone was inside the Cessna, the plane took off and gained altitude until it reached the 4,000-foot mark. The side door slid open, and then one by one, the skydivers hopped from the plane and popped their parachutes open. Victoria was the last one out, and she smiled as she looked down, took a breath, and then made the leap. As she gained speed, she took just a brief moment to enjoy the feeling of falling before pulling her parachute cord. As soon as she did, it was immediately clear that something was terribly wrong. When it deployed, it folded in on itself, and the lines that held it to the harness were twisted around Victoria and one another. In this chaos, she struggled to deploy her reserve chute, but once she did, it failed too. So horrifyingly, there was nothing to slow Victoria's fall, and at 60 miles or 96 kilometers an hour, she slammed into the ground. Now, accidents can happen doing anything, but for an activity with a reputation for being dangerous, skydiving is actually surprisingly safe. One study collected and analyzed data from 62 million recreational jumps and found that the average rate of injury while skydiving is just 0.044%, and the fatality rate is even lower at just 0.0011%. To further drive this point home, according to the British Parachute Association, 2.3 million jumps took place in the UK between 2005 and 2015. From that dataset, there were 2,900 jumps that required the reserve chute to be deployed, and of those instances, there wasn't one single case of reserve chute failure. Those who saw Victoria spinning and descending rapidly were obviously and understandably horrified by what they witnessed. The first emergency personnel on the scene were so convinced that this was going to be a retrieval as opposed to a rescue that they brought a body bag with them. Victoria, however, was somehow still alive, although she was in bad shape. The impact of the fall had broken her spine, snapped her ribs, and shattered her pelvis. There were two factors that prevented her from being killed entirely. Victoria had a petite frame, and she landed in a farmer's field that had just been plowed, so the ground was soft and it cushioned her just enough. As paramedics worked to assess her injuries and get her ready for transport, Chief Skydiving Instructor Mark assessed Victoria's equipment, and his wealth of experience immediately told him that something about her parachute was suspicious. Skydivers are fitted with a harness that's secured over the shoulders and around each thigh. Attached to that is the container that holds the parachute, which sits on the jumper's back. A properly deployed parachute will have a large canopy with multiple suspension lines connecting to an apparatus just above the container called a riser. Mark couldn't help but notice that the lines on one side of her main parachute were knotted up, and on the reserve chute, the risers weren't attached to the lines at all. After Victoria had been rushed off to the airfield on her way to the hospital, Mark took a closer look at the records related to that specific pack. Just 2 months earlier, it passed inspection, and since it was put into use, it had been officially checked 16 times by 10 different parachute packers, all of whom were expert skydivers. This left Mark with little choice but to call the police. However, authorities initially didn't see much of a reason to investigate. It looked to them like a clear-cut accident. After an interview with one of her friends, though, it was revealed that Emile and Victoria had an incredibly toxic relationship behind the scenes. This prompted police to begin looking a little closer into the couple. At the time, Emile was a 38-year-old citizen of England, but he was born in South Africa. When he was 16, he met a 13-year-old named Nicolene, and they began dating soon after. On her 16th birthday, she gave birth to the couple's first child. They were young, but to Nicolene, it was a chapter in a love story that she knew would last a lifetime. She couldn't believe how lucky she was to have Emile. He was charismatic, even as a teenager, and romantic too. Every month, he'd recognize their anniversary with long stem roses, but unfortunately, this was all a bit of a ruse. Behind his charm was a web of deception that only became more tangled as Emile aged. After having 2 children with Nicolene, Emile secured a working holiday visa for the UK, which he used to get jobs at bars and pubs. It was supposed to be a temporary move, and Nicolene expected him to be back in South Africa when the visa expired, but Emile didn't return. Then, because he couldn't do it himself, he would later convince his mother to call Nicolene and inform her that he had met someone in the UK and got married. Nicolene was obviously devastated. The couple had just moved into an apartment together before he left South Africa, and now Nicolene was faced with the prospect of raising 2 children by herself. But either way, for years, the pair lived separate lives, and Emile had nothing to do with the children he left behind. As their firstborn daughter got older, she became more and more curious about her father and asked Nicolene if it was possible to get to know him. She was hesitant at first, but she eventually reached out to Emile about visiting. He and his then wife Carly were open to meeting up, so they made plans for a day at a water park. By then, Emile and Carly had 2 more children of their own, and this marked the first time that any of the half-siblings met. As the day wore on, Nicolene was trying desperately to push the feelings down, but it didn't matter. She was still attracted to Emile. He also later mentioned that he and Carly were on the path to divorce and that he wanted to get back together with Nicolene. She barely gave it any thought before the two were together again, this time in the UK. Afterward, Nicolene was under the impression that Emile left Carly, but when he left his phone at her house one day, it rang with Carly on the other line. That's when Nicolene and Carly found out that they were both being deceived by Emile. Years later, Emile and Victoria met, leading to that fateful Easter Sunday in 2015. At the time, Emile was a Royal Army physical training instructor, and after the initial investigation, police showed up at his barracks to take him into custody on suspicion of murder. They would then interrogate him for 6 hours, during which Emile was surprisingly forthcoming about yet another double life he was leading, this one with an Austrian skydiving instructor he met on Tinder. During his conversation with authorities, Emile was asked to retrace his steps on April 4th and 5th, and this is when police learned about his long trip to the washroom. However, because he was so sure of himself and confident in his abilities to talk anyone into or out of anything, Emile completely missed that he just provided authorities with motive, means, and opportunity. Unsurprisingly, he would still maintain his innocence, and when he was asked if he had anything to say at the end of the interrogation, Emile gave police a tongue lashing, saying that the worst part about the whole ordeal was that they arrested him in front of his subordinates. As this was all going on, Victoria was recovering from her extensive injuries when she was told by investigators they believed Emile sabotaged her parachute during his stop to the washroom. This was news that at first she just couldn't accept. There was no way her husband was responsible for her nearly fatal fall, and she would remain convinced of this throughout his 2 trials. In the first, the jury couldn't reach a verdict, but in the second trial, the jury had no problem coming to a consensus. Emile was then found guilty of 2 counts of attempted murder. If you're wondering where the second charge came from, his tampering with the parachute was actually his second attempt to kill her in less than a week. During her interviews with investigators, she told police about what she viewed as a silly mistake Emile had made the Monday before her fall. Apparently, while going through her morning routine, Victoria noticed the thick smell of gas in the kitchen. She then checked the valve inside the cupboard and it was wide open. The handle also had blood on it too, all of which she found confusing. After turning the valve off, she texted Emile to jokingly ask if he was trying to take her out, but she had no idea that this wasn't a joke. Even with the knowledge that their 2 children would be asleep upstairs, Emile opened the valve the day before and then told Victoria that he was going to spend the night at the barracks. Instead, he spent the night at Carly's while simultaneously texting his Austrian girlfriend, reaching out to ladies of the night. Police later determined that the blood belonged to Emile and he had put so much force into opening the valve that he had injured his hand in the process. Emile is now currently serving a life sentence with a minimum of 18 years to serve before he can be considered for parole. Incredibly, Victoria made several media appearances after Emile was found guilty and told interviewers that she just couldn't see how her husband could be capable of trying to kill her. It took all the way until 2020 for her to accept the truth. She then filed for divorce, but Emile initially refused to sign the papers, keeping her trapped in the marriage until he eventually relented. The saga continues even into 2024 as Emile is battling Victoria in court to get a share of the profits from the sale of the house they own together. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.